thought or the assumption that people who are overweight or obese are that way because they're choosing to be that way, because they have no impulse control, because they are unwilling to go to the gym and, make overhauls to their lifestyle and improve their health and make better food choices. I push back on that very, very, very strongly. And it's not because I discount people's ability to dictate their health outcomes and choose better habits and exert, I love the word agency. We've talked about this. I love agency, right? Exert agency over their path in life. And the reason I push back so hard on that is because no matter what you do at the conscious decision level, none of that matters to the degree that your genetics matter. None of that matters. And the only things that you can do at the conscious decision level or the environmental level is influence how your genes are expressed, right? So a good place to start here is not necessarily, I don't think the obesity side of things, because obesity is so complex and it has so many variables associated with it, whether we're talking about the heritable variables and what is coming from your genetics and from your family versus what is environmental, what is learned, what is, again, more habit oriented or conscious choice oriented. But zooming out, I like looking at something like height, because we know, and I don't think it would take a fucking genius to figure this out, that height is extremely heritable.
Right.
If your parents are Brittany Griner and Shaq, you're probably going to be fucking tall, right? We understand that. But just because you have the genetics that dictate you being 6'5" in a perfect scenario or in the most likely scenario, doesn't mean that if you are extremely malnourished as an infant and as a child, that you will reach 6'5". It just doesn't mean that, right? So there are environmental aspects at play that might make you shorter or even taller than you're genetically predisposed to being. Another really important lifestyle factor here is if you get both of your legs cut off in a car accident, you're not going to be 6'5", no matter what your genes say that you're going to be, right? Your genes just put you on that path. Like what we talked about in the last podcast that we recorded, right? Your genetic code is essentially, it's just a big, deep ditch, and you're just rolling down that ditch. Doesn't mean that you can't escape that ditch. It doesn't mean that you can't widen that ditch. It doesn't mean that there's not a tributary that's popping off of that ditch that takes you in a different route, right? It just means that that is the most likely path that you will be on unless something pushes you off of that path. But that is where environmental factors come into play. That's where lifestyle comes into play. That's where your family comes into play, your education, your socioeconomic status. These things are incredibly important, right? But they all feed back on your own genetics and how your genetics and your genes are expressed or suppressed, which is another really important aspect, right? It's not just expression. Your genes can get turned on or off,
right?
And then that also has some really important effects for what your phenotype. So genotype, your genetics, right? Phenotype is how your genetics are expressed, how those things are shown outwardly. So I think it's very important to say that like your environment, it can affect your phenotype through your genotype, right? So that's what people who reduce this to a binary question or a binary answer, they conveniently overlook, right? I think a lot of it is really, whenever we're talking about obesity, I think it dehumanizes people who are obese, and it removes a lot of the sympathy that we all should feel for people that have an unfortunate genetic disposition. But again, it doesn't mean that they have to be that way. Right? But if you demonize them and you say, you're only fat because you're choosing to be fat, like that's not doing anybody any good. That's not helping them, right? But at the same time, saying that they're fat because their genes tell them that they're going to be fat, and that means that they're going to be fat no matter what, nothing that they can do with their choices or their their nutrition or their, exposure to toxins in the environment, like that also doesn't mean that that is the route that they're destined to be on. So it's important that everyone gives not equal credence to environmental and genetic factors, but appropriate credence and appropriate weight to both of those things, in which case genetics has a inappropriate and dissized or outsized weight compared to the environment, but that doesn't mean that the environment is negligible in its effects.
Yeah, the environment can obviously be so apparent, right? Like the downstream effects of a child raised in a very abusive home, right? And you're like, well, I don't even know what is genetically present, because what happened to you on an environmental level is so apparent that we can't even look at, like, well, what would have been different if you had different genes. I think about this like as you were talking, in my mind, all I kept seeing was like a strainer or like a water filter, right? Like you can change the liquid that passes through a strainer, but you cannot change the strainer. Like it's going to be the same strainer, and you can have more favorable fluids and whatnot try to permeate it, and certain things will get through, certain things will take, and certain things won't. But the strainer stays the same. And like for me, looking at genes that way, like, hey, those are going to be the same regardless. The only thing you can optimize here is the environment, right? You can try to like, okay, let's get things to work well here, right? Let's pass the right things through the strainer to hopefully get the best outcome. And I think that is a really good picture for those listening when you're trying to discern what matters more here, right? Like what am I doing? What's happening to me versus who I am and what I am. Where should I be paying the most attention? And like you said, the appropriate amount, right? And also, if you understand one, like people have they're getting their genetic codes mapped and marked and whatnot, and understanding there's certain predispositions for certain things, and then thus changing their environments to make sure that they get the most favorable expression of the genes that they've been born with, because they can't change those. Mm-hmm. And I think that is cool. And also you can take that and go, this is a really cool way to look at it when you're looking at it from a third party point of view. Someone who is maybe super, super, like you have a friend who's depressed, and you look at their life objectively and you're just like, dude, I'm struggling here. Like, I'm like, I get it. I have empathy and I want you to feel better and I want you to smile and not want to end your life and so on and so forth. And also I'm like, objectively, I'm like, there are people out there who are not depressed who have been through worse. And maybe that's an opportunity for you to go, but maybe this is it's a you thing, and it's not a bad thing that it's a you thing, but it's just me being mindful and the world being mindful, and even now you becoming more mindful of like, okay, I have a predisposition to venture into some really dark places. Like there are some things that are seemingly objectively small that can just push me over the edge. So now I need to be more mindful of where I spend my time, my energy, making sure I get that time to myself to really invest and uplift myself. You become more mindful of those things because you understand your genetic code and the way it's going to operate in certain environments. Like you said, being able to not discount either. You can't outwork your genes. You can't do that. But you can give yourself the most favorable outcome of your genes.
100%. 100%. And I think that that's the most important aspect of this, right? Is there is a large variation in outcomes even within people that have the same genes. And we open this with twins, right? So I think it is a really interesting, not even just thought experiment. It's interesting to look at the experiments that have actually been done. If you take identical twins that were birthed out of the same womb, and at birth, or maybe, just after birth, you separate them, right? So maybe one stays with the same family, stays with the birth mother, and one goes to an adoptive mother or adoptive family. And you do the same thing with fraternal twins that are not sharing the same genetic code, but share a lot of similarities, more than even regular siblings would have. And you do the same thing with siblings, and you see, okay, what happens whenever you take people who have very, very similar, if not identical, genetic codes, and then you give them different environmental exposures. What happens there? We know what happens, right? We know what happens is that a lot of the outcomes are determined in ways by how close their genetic codes are, but it is not one-to-one mapping. There are going to be a lot more similarities with identical twins that are separated at birth than there would be siblings separated at birth. But there are still differences. The range just compresses whenever we're talking about identical genetic codes. But I think that should give everyone cause for pause whenever they hear something like people can share the same genes and still have different lives. Because that does mean that nurture matters to a degree, right? I really love analogies whenever it comes to this stuff. I like the ball rolling down a hill. I think that one's helpful. I also really like the analogy of cooking. And if you think of the genetic code or someone's genes as the raw ingredients, and if you think of the environment as the instructions for the recipe, right? You can take people that have the exact same ingredients, but you can make vastly different foods depending on what recipe you use, how long you cook, the types of cooking that you use, the way that you stir something. It all compresses into whatever that outcome is. But that's the thing, right? Like there are a lot of factors that come from the environment. If we're using the cooking analogy, again, the heat. If you're using a higher heat when baking, you're going to get a different outcome. If you are baking versus if you're poaching, you're going to get a different outcome, right? So all of these things, they influence what that final product is, what the cake is going to look like on the other side. And you can have a very, very, very similar tasting cake, whether you have chocolate chips as the starting ingredient or whether you have peanut butter chips as a starting ingredient, right? Even though you're looking at that, you're saying the ingredients themselves are fundamentally different. The cake still tastes the fucking same if the recipe is the same, right? Like, yeah, it's slightly different, but most people don't even notice.
Right.
Like that, and that's the thing. So yeah, some genes will also have outsized impacts. If you are, let's say, making a burger, again, going back to the cooking analogy, if you're making a burger and you use bison for the meat in one and you use chicken for the meat in the other, you're going to notice that difference whenever you're eating that burger, right? But if you use bison meat versus, cow meat, I mean, it's pretty fucking close. Like, yeah, you'll probably be able to tell a difference, but like most people will have a pretty, close palate there to the degree that it's not going to really like gross someone out versus, someone's going to love it or hate it, right? So I am very much on board with this idea of like trying to analogize as many things as possible whenever it comes to genetics versus environment. And you did mention before we were talking about IQ, and I think that that's like a sticky subject because most people really, really do not like to get into the heritability of intelligence. But it is useful to use as a landmark in this discussion. And this is all going to come back around to us talking about fitness and health, I promise. But I think it is maybe good for us to swing to the other end of the pendulum where like this is a very sensitive topic to talk about whenever we're talking about like the heritability of intelligence. But I did mention it as an example whenever I made my post yesterday, and I covered it really briefly, but Einstein. I don't think that too many people would argue the fact that Einstein has a genetic disposition towards intelligence. He is inarguably going to be at a higher starting point than most other people in the world, and probably most other people who have ever lived, right? How much of his intelligence came from his education versus his socioeconomic status versus his family around him versus, you know, his nutritional status. Hard to say. But I would be willing to bet a large sum of money that no matter what his environment did, it wasn't going to make up the heritable gap that he already had on most other people, right? Myself, probably would not matter too much what I do in my life. I'm never going to reach Einstein level intelligence. That sucks, right? Like I can read every book. I can put myself in every possible position to soak up intelligence and soak up other people's experience and take all the nootropics in the world that I possibly can to like improve my brain function. But like, it's probably not going to get me even a fraction of the way to Einstein and like, you know, discovering laws of physics and shit, right? Not going to happen for me, unfortunately. And I don't think that that's controversial to say.
Right.
I would hope that that's not controversial to say, right? So I say that to also say that whenever we're talking about heritability, there is an implicit unfairness associated with that. There just is, right? It's not fair that some people are born smarter than other people with a genetic predisposition to being smarter than other people. It's not fair that some people are born with the genetic code that tells them to be taller than other people. It's also not fair that some people are born with genetics that dictate that they are leaner and more muscular and more athletic than other people. I will never be the athletic specimen that LeBron James is. It's my genetics, and it's his genetics. And that sucks. That's just the way that life is. He has a great work ethic, but like, I'll never be there. I don't understand why it's so hard to make these connections between things like obesity or body fat percentage or lean body mass or anything like that that has, you know, multiple variables at play. But we can very easily look towards like LeBron or Michael Jordan or Serena Williams or any of these people and be like, yeah, they're just fucking athletes and they were born to be athletes. You know what I mean? Like, we can all admit that. It doesn't hurt our feelings to say that person is a genetic specimen. That is a compliment, right? It doesn't diminish how hard they work, but like, bro, you were fucking born to dribble a basketball. Like, good, like, great job. Like, congrats, right? I also don't think that it's controversial to say that like my genes for body composition are better than a lot of other people's. And I think that is something I'm happy about, obviously, but like, I didn't do anything to earn my genetic code. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. I just got fortunate with that aspect of my genes. And you could say that like, I'm lucky for that, but I would also counter and say, well, I have a higher genetic predisposition to getting hurt as well. So like, that part of it isn't as fun. Like, I've dealt with a lot of injuries over my lifetime, which other people have luckily been able to avoid, whether that's my stupidity or whether that's my body just being a little bit more fragile in certain aspects. I'm not sure. But with obesity, I want to circle back around to this because we can probably talk about this for longer than it needs to be talked about. But again, I want to be very clear whenever I say that lifestyle matters. Your nutrition matters, obviously. Your exercise, your physical activity, it matters a great deal towards your ability to maintain a body mass and a body weight or lose body mass, lose body weight. But if you're fighting upstream because your genetic code is pushing you in a direction that says higher body mass, higher body weight, it's always going to be more difficult for that person, even if they're doing everything perfectly and their environment is set up optimally for them to be X body weight, X body mass, right? So all of that to say, I know that this is just kind of going on a monologue right now, but it's important, right? Like, it is really important that people understand these things. It's so simple and easy, and I think low hanging to say that if you're obese, it's because you're choosing to not do the things that we know make you less obese and less fat and more healthy.
Right.
But It really is not that simple. And the quicker and sooner that we can all understand that the deck is not even, it's stacked against some people, I think the quicker we'll actually be able to help those people as well.
Yeah. No, that was really good. A couple of things that you mentioned, like you said, we don't need to belabor points, and I have a haircut in a little bit, but I think, so I don't think the IQ conversation is any more sensitive than the obesity conversation is any more sensitive than the mental health conversation, in my opinion, and I know you also agree. I think, especially when it comes down to sensitive subjects like how smart someone is or what someone looks like, because that's, in humans, that's what we look at, like, oh, they're smart people we revere, fat people we look at a little weird, and like we hold people differently in these categories here. And mental health is kind of getting there, right? Where it's like, okay, well, cool, like this person struggles with these things, are these taboo anymore? Is this person not, operating in any level of agency? Are they just kind of succumbing to, again, the conversation continues to go on because there's a lot of context. And I think what happens is you have people who, like the individual you responded to, on the other end as well. For instance, the IQ conversation to me only gets sensitive if a person stops at, well, you have Asians, you have white people, and black people, and that's how the cookie crumbles, right? It's like, okay, well, one, the science is actually interesting, right? In support of that, there's been a lot of studies that have come out that a person's IQ, especially at an early age when tested, is significantly proportionate to their size of their head and the size of their brain, right? The cranial space they have. And if you look at that, the averages are East Asian, white, black, as far as total cranial space. And even inside of those subsects, the kids with larger cranial space are the smartest of those subsects. It's very interesting. That's very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
I think when you take that and you, in my opinion, oversimplify it, well, like, here are the average IQs, and this is why. See, you guys are just born stupid, right? Relatively. I think that's where it incites a level of like, wait, well, hold on.
Well, that's where you start getting into like eugenics, right?
Yeah. And you kind of bypass what I think we're trying to do, which is bring color to the conversation.
Right.
I actually am really interested in the conversation. Tell me that you fucking abducted 30 kids of each of the races. You put them all in the same place with the same food and the same teachers and the same this and the same that, and then tell me what their average IQ dispersion is. I want to know that data. That to me is interesting.
Yeah.
Because again, the context, what you put through the strainer does matter. And when you have something like obesity, which also heavily impacts minority groups, it's like, okay, well, how much of this is food knowledge? How much of this is food access and food security? And being able to kind of like parse through that. I don't think that we actually have to, right? I think the people who are coming with the facts, like this person, guy or girl, whoever posted what you responded to, if you just come understanding context, you'll say that differently. Just like a person on the other end saying, well, here are the IQ dispersions, and here's the headspace information, and here's the mental health, susceptibility. When you see your mom deals with depression, you're more likely to accept your own depression and then dive deeper into it. Like, instead of trying to parse through what matters more, understanding that, you know what, in your own unique situation, there's a good chance you should probably just pay the personal, appropriate amount of attention to both your strainer and what you put through it. And then from there, you can figure out what makes the most sense and how things should align for you. Anytime I think that we come in and we oversimplify things, like you said, you do a deep disservice to people, you dehumanize them. And it's like, I'm like, dude, I met a lot of really dumb black people and really dumb white people. I got a few stoner Asian friends, and I don't think that any better environment would have made them smarter than me. And that's just my opinion. But also, it's not discounting that they also had an environment that was probably different than mine. And mine could have been better or worse. And who knows how those made me respond. Like, you know what? Hey, I'm in a fucked up position. I'm going to overcome. I'm in a fucked up position and I'm going to succumb. like those are things that can also be traced back to genes and your susceptibility to things. So I think that context is probably just the biggest piece, and being able to, like you said, appropriate the appropriate amount of importance based on the individual.
Unfortunately, the ways that we learn the most about environmental impacts are to the downside. But have you ever looked into the effects of lead in the environment on IQ?
No. I mean, I imagine there's probably not a great
It's so after we get off this, I would highly encourage you to look up some of the detrimental effects that lead has had on people's intelligence. So I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but so lead used to be in everything. Lead used to be in everything. So we used to add lead to our gasoline to prevent engine knocking. So it raised the octane levels in gasoline so that it essentially created like more combustion and higher pressures. So when we added lead to gasoline, obviously lead became a pollutant as well. Well, lead is extremely neurotoxic, and we knew it back then, but we didn't realize the severity of the neurotoxicity of lead. So it's thought that our use of lead in things like paint and things like gasoline dropped the average IQ for like, I think 1 or 2 generations by like 10 points. So that's not like a few people we're talking the average IQ. I don't know I think it might have just been in like the US. I don't know if it was globally how I was looking at it, but that is the most ridiculous environmental effect you could ever, like, that's the equivalent in a lot of ways at looking at the heights of people who survive a famine.
Right.
Everyone is short. If you survive a famine, you're typically also going to be a lower intelligence because your brain it was not able to develop normally. It wasn't able to grow in a way that a healthy brain would if it was nourished well and if you were not suffering from pollutants in your environment, right? So again, these things typically happen to the downside, and then that's how we can measure how heritable something is versus the environmental effect that things in nurture can have, right? But I do think that one passage of a book that I read recently, I'm really big on like genes. I think that genetics are incredibly, incredibly interesting, but also incredibly important for everyone to understand at a fundamental level, right? So we've talked about the importance of genetics. We've talked about how the environment can feed back on the genetic code and regulate that expression or suppression, right? But it's important to understand even something like being abused as a child, that doesn't just directly change you, that changes how your genetics are expressed. Like it changes your wiring in your brain. It changes the neurotransmitters in your brain to then be essentially traumatized and to start having different outputs. So everything does trace back, even trauma, to the genetic level. You can call it epigenetics if you want to, but it's still genetics. It's how your genes are expressing themselves. So I do want to read this because I think that it's really important. So the correlation between 2 siblings in weight, according to one study, is 34%. The similarity between parents and children is a little lower at 26%. How much of this similarity is due to the fact that they live together and eat similar food, and how much to the fact that they share many of the same genes? Well, identical twins reared in the same family have a correlation of 80%, while fraternal twins reared together have only a 43% similarity, which suggests that genes matter rather more than shared eating habits. What about adoptees? The correlation between adoptees and their adoptive parents is only 4%. And that is between unrelated siblings in the same family, and that between unrelated siblings in the same family is just 1%. By contrast, identical twins reared apart in different families are still 72% similar in weight. That's fucking crazy, all right? So next part, conclusion, weight is largely due to genes, not eating habits. So throw away the diet advice and let rip with the ice cream? Of course not. The study says nothing about the causes of weight. It only reveals something about the causes of difference in weight within a particular family. Given the same access to food, some people will put on more weight than others. People are getting fatter in Western societies, not because their genes are changing, but because they are eating more and taking less exercise. But when everybody has similar access to food, the ones who put on the weight fastest will be the ones with certain genes. So variation in weight can be inherited, even while changes in the average can be environmental. That, to me, is a phenomenal summary of everything that we're talking about, obesity related, right? So all things being equal, everything comes down to the genetic code, right? All things environmental being equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
But reverse that, all things genetic being equal, if we're talking about identical twins, then all of the differences come down to the environment.
Yep.
But the variation between those is not the same. The disparity between variation in outcomes for identical twins, even with different environments, is still relatively narrow. But if we put two people in the same environments with completely different genetic codes, their outcomes will be completely different, completely uncorrelated, right? That's where a lot of this correlation data comes from, and that's what's pointing towards. So ultimately what that all talks about is genetics, outsized importance, no matter what. Body weight, obesity, intelligence, height, even propensity for mental health issues, schizophrenia. We can trace schizophrenia back through your genetic code, back through your genetic line, and say, okay, if you have an aunt or a grandfather that has schizophrenia, you're more likely to have schizophrenia. We know that, right? But there are also, for sure, theories of environmental factors affecting schizophrenia can spark a psychotic break and spark schizophrenia in some people that have a propensity for it, right? So was it the genetics that caused them to have schizophrenia, or was it the hallucinogen-induced psychotic break? Both. It's both, right? Is it people's genetics that make them overweight, or is it them overeating food? It's both. It is absolutely both. So at the end of the day, it's important that like we as health professionals, whatever the fuck we are, it's important that we like keep that in mind whenever we're having these discussions with people, right? Because it allows us to humanize them. It allows us to remain sympathetic to their situation and also help them. Like if we say it's only your environment, it's only nurture, or it's only nature, it's only your genetics, that doesn't allow any room for them to be helped.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm coming from with all of this. I think that's why I get like so frustrated with a lot of the rhetoric around this polarization between like it's only nature versus it's only nurture, when for anyone who has a brain, it's pretty easy to see that it's both, you know?
100%. I mean, like you said, it's what we do as coaches. It's why we don't do cookie cutter bullshit. It's why we work with people one-on-one. It's why we're in business, right? If someone could just go factory, copy, paste, repeat someone else's shit, then they wouldn't need us. So yeah, like you said, it's both. And then oversimplification of it on either end is doing whatever you're looking at, whomever you're looking at, a disservice. And also you a disservice because, again, your ability to help that person or those people drastically decreases because you've oversimplified what they're actually dealing with and what they're going. If you guys have thoughts, questions, we'd love to hear this. This is actually, again, a really fun conversation. It has to do a lot with why we do what we do and how we do what we do. But we would love to hear your feedback in the comments and DM us, repost on your stories, share, et cetera, et cetera. And we will see you guys on the other side. Talk to you next time.